Welcome everybody to this Global Institute for Women's Leadership webinar addressing driving diversity through businesses, through business practice. This webinar is being brought in partnership to you with the 30% Club, and at the core of what we're going to talk about today is a new report from the 30% Club entitled Missing Millions, a very intriguing title, Missing Millions. And to take us to that report, I am going to firstly turn to Brenda Trinowden, who's already modelling the report for you there. That's fantastic. To Brenda, who actually needs very little introduction. Brenda is a partner at PwC, but she's probably better known to many who have joined us today through her work at the 30% Club. The 30% Club started a campaign to get more women onto corporate boards. It not only succeeded so well in the UK, that effort has gone global. It is now moving well beyond 30%, well beyond corporate boards, into considering issues of management, and now also how we can drive equality through business practice. So Brenda, if you could present to us the findings of this report, I'd be very grateful. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Julia. Delighted to be here today, and hopefully Rebecca has the slides. Fantastic. So this initiative, Are You Missing Millions, was really born out of a conversation that I had together with Birgit New, with the former CEO of HSBC, John Flint. And usually after a 30% Club CEO signs up, we have a meeting and talk about how they can really activate the 30% Club in their organization and bring it to life. And what John said to me was, inclusion and diversity shouldn't be several layers down within HR. It should be part of strategy. And really, companies should be putting an I&D lens across everything a company does. And so we talked about it a bit further, and ultimately it led to the formation of the 30% Club Strategy Best Practice Group, which launched the campaign last November to really showcase examples of leading companies which have put a gender lens over critical aspects of their businesses, leading to positive commercial outcomes. Next slide, please. So what we ask in the report and in the campaign is, if women and men were truly in equal consideration, how much stronger would your business be? And really, the focus now must be on unlocking the commercial benefit of building gender diversity into strategy. You know, it's not an HR problem, but it's a huge and largely untapped strategic and commercial opportunity to really differentiate your business, boost brand loyalty, and reinforce your social license to operate. Businesses that have realized this are generating more revenues and retaining more customers, and it can be applied to broader aspects of inclusion. When we launched, for example, Caroline Casey, the founder of Valuable 500, told us that she's taking a similar approach with companies in considering the opportunities for designing products, services, and advertising for their customers who have disabilities. And on top of this, there are, of course, increasing expectations from a growing number of external stakeholders that business needs to do more to ensure its long-term sustainability. Next slide, please. So let's look at some examples and really help bring this to life. The first one is Vodafone, who was a member of our group. And Vodafone, when they looked at their markets and they broke them down by gender, they discovered that women are 10% less likely than men to own a mobile phone in the low and middle income countries. And that translates into a mobile gender gap of 200 million women who don't have the same ability as men to communicate, to access information, to learn, manage their finances, set up and run a business, and even get help if they feel threatened. Next slide, please. So why did they focus on this, and you know, how did they approach it? Well, Vodafone decided that they would make a commitment to connect 50 million more women across the emerging market footprint and really narrow that gender connectivity gap. And they committed to do that by 2025. Next slide, please. So how did they do it? Well, first they worked out why women weren't buying phones. And there was a whole issue about how women bought phones and their numbers being exposed. And so they dealt with that. But then they set up Saki in India with location alerts for women. They set up the mom and baby service in South Africa for healthcare, child development, and reproductive health information. And they made these services free. Next slide, please. And what were the outcomes, importantly? Well, I'm pleased to say they've connected 20 million of their 50 million target already. Millions of women have subscribed to Saki. Over 1 million women signed up to the mom and baby service within the first 10 months. And that resulted in an increase in 650,000 more vaccinations, amongst many other things. And of course, there's been a corresponding increase in both loyalty and spend. Next slide, please. So one other quick example from me to bring it to life, Unilever and their unstereotype advertising. When Unilever looked at the impact of their advertising campaigns by gender, they found that over 40% of the women they surveyed couldn't relate to the women in their ads. Next slide, please. And this is really important for a company like Unilever because they reckon that 70% of the people making decisions to buy their brands are women. And guess what? It wasn't just the women who didn't like the cleaning obsessed stereotypes. The men also disliked the stereotypes of men being useless around the house. And so Unilever tried to turn it on its head and think about actually cleaning outcomes as opposed to who's doing the cleaning. But more importantly, they started thinking about creating unstereotyped images. Next slide, please. So in 2015, they launched Unstereotype as a company-wide initiative. And in 2017, they joined forces with UN Women to launch the Unstereotype Alliance and bring the whole industry together to use the power of advertising to help shape perceptions that reflect realistic and unstereotypical portrayals of women and men. And actually, they campaigned and I think they funded Getty Images to go out and source a whole load of unstereotypical images that everyone can use in advertising. Next slide, please. So importantly, what were the outcomes for Unilever? Well, since 2016, they've tested 1,500 ads covering 370 Unilever brands in 54 markets around the world. And the ads with more progressive role depictions show an uplift on short and long-term metrics, including 37% more brand impact, a 28% uplift in purchase intent, a 35% increase in the enjoyment of their ads, a 30% increase in credibility, and a 17% increase in relevance. So not insignificant. Next slide, thank you. So this is about an enterprise-wide buy-in. It's about challenging every part of your business to think beyond the standard way of operating. Next slide, please. It's about turning your ambition into action. It's a culture change. So we want you to stop thinking that I&D is the responsibility of HR alone, and that it's just about counting the women in your organization. Next slide, please. So where do you begin? Well, of course, it starts with the data. What data do you have on your existing and potential customers, your suppliers and communities, and what do you need? Do you know if your spend is adding or detracting from your gender ambitions? And importantly, how do you weave gender considerations into your design thinking, your process re-engineering, your data analytics, and others, so that it becomes business as usual, just as sustainability has for most organizations? What do you need to do to de-bias? And how do you drive buy-in for this agenda throughout your value chain, which you'll hear more about later. Next slide, please. So we've started thinking about a maturity framework, and this is what we've been developing. And I would just say that I would argue that if you are in the leading end of the maturity framework, then your organization probably has a role like the one that Aubrey Blanche has at Culture Amp in Australia. She's the first global head of equitable design and impact. Isn't that a great role? Final slide, please. So how do you get started? Well, I'm going to leave that to you to think about throughout this session. But I hope I've given you some context and challenged your thinking on I&D and positioned it really as a commercial imperative as well as a force for good, and set the scene for my fellow panelists who are actually practicing this in their day-to-day jobs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brenda, for taking us through that content. This is a very rich report. So you've summarised some of the content, but there is much more for people to look at in this report, and much more now to feed into our discussion with the panel, where we're going to go a level deeper. I'm going to invite first into the conversation Daniel Clear, who's the Global Head of Sustainable Finance at HSBC. Daniel, we've just heard with Brenda's opening and the summary of the report, this very commercial lens, which I think might be quite new to a number of people who are listening in. They haven't thought about these issues through the commercial prism before. And they might well be cogitating on that last question that Brenda put up before us, which is, how do I get started? What advice would you give on that?
Julia, thank you. And Brenda, nice to see you. And thank you for that great introduction. For us, this was really a quite eye-opening exercise. As Brenda said, John Flynn came back from a meeting with Brenda and came to me and said, well, I really like this debate, but I think it is too boxed in. Right? We need to make this much more systematic part of our strategy. And I think it was absolutely right. I don't need to tell you that gender has been a big priority for us. But we looked at it from a single lens. We looked at it from an HR lens, from a representation lens. It's a very, very important lens, but it's only one lens. And so when Brenda and I started the working group, it really became clear to us that there's an entire market out there that we're not addressing. There's an entire market out there that we actually don't understand. And let me give you a few examples what this means for a financial services firm. When you look at founders of new companies, we looked at US data. Only 2.2% of venture capital funding today goes to female-backed venture startups. We estimate there is a 1.5 trillion credit gap for SMEs that are backed by women. And maybe even more importantly and closer to our heart here, in most households, the female is making financial decisions. But if you then think about how we currently bank a lot of our clients and how we finance, we do it with a prism that is very much geared towards male decision makers, because that's a lot of how our processes are built. We know that women have the same problem in credit applications that they often have in interviews. They undersell themselves. If you don't filter that out in data, you will make the wrong credit decisions. You will be more likely to give credit to a man than to a woman, because we know that is a behavior trait. So I'll give you a few examples what we did when we looked at this topic and some of the initiatives that we started. So one thing that we did is we started a gender lens banking initiative, because we realized there are a lot of companies out there that want to make gender more important. And this is a grand name for what it really is we help companies issue bonds and other instruments to support gender initiatives. We partnered, for instance, with the World Bank on a large bond issuance for women-backed SMEs, especially in emerging markets, to support those causes. We also partnered with Albright, and many of you know Albright. We created an initiative together with them to bring mentoring and financial knowledge to female entrepreneurs. Right? If we know they actually have a problem getting venture capital and bank funding, there is something we can do to actually prepare them much better for this. And most importantly, we started a big exercise in actually understanding our customer base much better. We understand our customer base in terms of the geographies that they are. We understand them based on income and based on their wealth. We don't ever really look at the gender and other diversity criteria. And if you want to change processes and take biases out of processes, you need to understand the data. Otherwise, you will always make wrong decisions. And so before I hand over to Sally, who will take us to the GSK example, I just want to give you 3 lessons that I think that we learned. The most important one was we need to unbox this and take this out of a pure HR lens. The HR lens is hugely important, and we're by far not where we have to be. But if you don't take this into the office of the CEO and you make this a group-wide topic that affects all the different bits, from consumers to suppliers to the communities that we work with to the HR discussion, we will never get there. Second, treat this as one of the biggest growth opportunities. There's a huge market out there, and some of the data points that we have seen, some of the data points that Brenda talked about, tell you that there is a market out there that we haven't properly captured yet. And if we don't do it, somebody else will do it. And third lesson, data, data, data. At the moment, we don't know enough about this. On the sustainability side, I think we made great progress, and we know how difficult data is. On the gender side, in terms of thinking about our customers, we don't know enough. So for me, we're coming out of a major economic, well, we are in a major economic crisis. We're hopefully coming out of this. We are all looking for growth. This has to be one of our big topics, how we think about the new normal. And I think what we have learned over the last year since we've been working on this together with Brenda and others has been quite transformational and really opened a lot of eyes across the organization. It's a great tool to excite people. So I'll hand over to Sally on that. I'm sure we'll come back towards the end how to do this and how to actually mobilize the wider organization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for that contribution. And I am going to turn to Sally next, Sally Jackson, who is the Senior Vice President, Global Communications and the CEO Office at GSK. And in the Are You Missing Millions report, there is an example of the work that GSK is doing. So Sally, I'm going to turn to you to take us through that example.
Thank you, Julia and Daniel. So hello, everybody. I'm here from GlaxoSmithKline, which, for those of you who don't know, is a company of 100,000 people across the world focused on developing medicines, vaccines, and everyday consumer healthcare products. So, as Daniel said, I had the opportunity to work with Brenda, Daniel, and others as part of the working group, and it truly was for me as well an eye-opening experience. I have to say, when I turned up and we were talking about, I wasn't quite sure what we were going to be talking about, because gender has been so ingrained as being something you think about as a company around your own workforce and your leadership. And like HSBC, GSK is pretty well progressed in that we have 45% of women on our board, 36% of women on our senior leadership positions. So it's been a big focus for us for a long time. But what I had never really thought about is the totality of how gender balance can impact your business more broadly. And as a result of many of those discussions, I would say that now we are really trying to think about this across three areas at GSK: our people, our business, and our communities. And they're all heavily connected. And what's very true, and we talked about this a lot in the working group, is very many of the same things apply across other minority populations as well. So with race and ethnicity such an important topic at the moment, a lot of this thinking we are also applying as we think through our approach to how we can do even more to support equality and representation, and across our business and across the other parts of the world we interact with. So as Julia said, the example that we shared in the report wasn't specific to us being a pharmaceutical company. It was more as our role as a large global organization, obviously interacting with suppliers across the world. So I'll touch on that in a moment. I just also wanted to reference one other area which is very specific to us being a healthcare company, which is around clinical trial diversity. And in the Invisible Woman book, which many of you I'm sure have read, this was highlighted as a really important area where we have to ensure that we don't have inherent bias in how we start even the very earliest of work in animals, and particularly how we ensure that the populations that are included in clinical trials are representative of the populations who suffer from a certain disease. Because, as I'm sure you can imagine, different people, certainly males versus females, will respond differently in terms of manifestation of disease, but also their potential response to different medications. So as a company, that's a very important focus area for us around how we ensure no bias in our clinical trials, which is harder than you may think, because actually the kind of people that would put themselves forward for trials will often be typically younger men with no family commitments. It's hard for women to turn up to take part in a trial sometimes because of other conflicting things they need to deal with in their lives. So you have to really think about this in how you, similarly to actually how you support women in the workplace, how you support women to be able to take part through how you run those trials, etc. So much of this thinking applies across the business lens in the same way as it applies in the representation space. And then just to touch on suppliers, which as I said, is what we included as our case study as part of this work. There is, as a massive global company, I think we have such an opportunity and obligation, in fact, to try and support a broader diversity and inclusion agenda outside of our own walls. But there's also, as Daniel and Brenda said, a really strong business imperative for this. Diverse suppliers can really help support our innovation agenda, our growth agenda. And again, much as we have to think about how we do this from our own employee base, in order to attract and ensure we select diverse suppliers, you need to do many of the same things in terms of, engaging in advocacy to ensure these people put themselves into your processes. You have to then ensure you take inherent bias out of your selection process. So I saw a fascinating statistic that most people will assume a small business or a minority-owned business may be less able to deliver on the business goals that you're asking for them. Research has shown that's absolutely not true. So you have to ensure that you're not coming in thinking just because this is a large, well-known supplier, they'll be better able to deliver. In some cases, maybe they will, but in many cases not. And then we've had to also move this from being what was frankly a bit like representation in the early days, a bit of a box checking, have we met thresholds, into really getting our procurement organization and our business more broadly to understand that there are business benefits to selecting a broader supplier base. And then just finally to touch on communities, for us, this is two areas, which is around how we support STEM education through minority populations, which is part of building a stronger workforce and broader representation of women and other minorities in STEM more broadly. And then particularly for us, women, like Daniel said, for financial services, women are often decision makers around healthcare. So particularly in the developing world, where we do quite a lot around education for women around healthcare to better enable them to support and seek access to the healthcare that they and their families need. So with that, thank you. I will hand back to you, Julia, I think.
Thank you very much, Sally, for outlining that. That's provoked a lot of thoughts, I'm sure. I'm going to turn now to Ebony Rainford-Brent, who would be known to people as a Sky Sports broadcaster. So bringing us all the sporting news, though at least at the outset of the pandemic, the sporting news was pretty few and far between, but a bit more sport happening now. And the director of Surrey Women's Cricket. And Ebony, I think, would also be known to people. She was involved with making a very powerful video with Michael Holding about experiences of racism in sport and day-to-day. So, Ebony, I'm going to ask you, from what you've heard in the discussion so far and the way that the report looks at gender, so brings a gender lens for business, how does that resonate with what you're seeing in sports around diversity and inclusion? Are the approaches the same or very different?
Yeah, I think the overall theme, which, whether it's gender we look at, whether it's race, is that the lens that we look at developing our environment, and I'm looking specifically from sport, has predominantly stayed the same, sort of white and male. And I think what we need to do is get that shift to thinking about the value and the opportunity that exists. And that's kind of what I'm hearing come across. And, I look at women's cricket, for example, which has almost revolutionized over the last few years in terms of professionalism. But actually, when you start to look at it as a commercial opportunity, we're seeing so much more. An example would be, I'm sure you may have seen, but the Australian Women's T20 World Cup. I was there only a few months ago before the World went into chaos as such. But the audience there, so 86,000 turned up to the MCG. On TV in Australia, it was the 6th most watched game ever, men's or women's, which starts to just blow your mind in terms of, you know, looking at the investment, but what we're seeing as an outcome. Across digital channels, so the ICC, who's the international governing body, had 1.1 billion views across their digital channels, and that's the 2nd most successful after the Men's World Cup, and that's of all global events. So that starts to build a picture. And I think even in the UK, we had the Women's World Cup just a few years ago, and the audience for the game was the largest on the Sky broadcast for that whole year, men's or women's. So I think when people start to compute the potential, the growth, what that can mean in ticket sales, in opportunities, in merchandise, in sources of talent, which is a lot of what I look at, and where we're bringing in you know, the communities from, it's massive. And I just think that what we've done is strategically cater to one audience, but what we're now seeing is just this shift has started to show some potential, and I think we really need to capitalize and strategically cater to women.
Thank you for that contribution, and thank you too for reminding me of a time when you could come to Australia so easily and be here for a fantastic sporting event. It seems like a very long time ago.
A long time. We'll get there. Yeah. We'll get there.
We'll get there again. And that's not a bad way of framing my first question to the panel, which is we are living at a time of global crisis, health pandemic, which is accompanied by an economic crisis. And so, you know, right around the world, communities are feeling a great deal of pressure, and businesses are feeling a great deal of pressure, and many of them are basically in survival mode. And so, you know, whilst businesses in that mode might kind of hear the messages from the report and from the panel today, you know, given the fatigue, the exhaustion of trying to get their businesses through, what would you want to say to them? What's the sort of elevator pitch about why, even when they're in these difficult times, they can't just put this at the bottom of the in tray and think, I'll get to it, you know, when I've got more time and more headspace? Why is it urgent to do it now? I'm happy to call on anybody from the panel who would like to take that question. Daniel, please.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. For me, this crisis is obviously a very fundamental economic crisis, but it is more than that, right? It accelerates, I think, a transition that we have seen before the crisis. People talk about the 4th Industrial Revolution, many topics that are related to this. So I think we see an accelerated transition to a world that is more digital, hopefully more sustainable, and where suddenly I think that diversity inclusion angle plays a so much more important role. So in my mind, we shouldn't look at this just as a very narrow lens, but this is likely a crisis that will take us a decade, if not two, forward for a normal development that would have happened over a much longer period of time. If you look at this crisis out of that perspective, I think you have a choice to make whether you are trying to pivot your business to a business model that is a lot more aligned with the future. And that takes a lot of effort and really hard work while you're trying to face liquidity crisis and profit crunch, or you're essentially just fighting the past. And for me, if you look at it from that perspective, it is very, very clear that 50% of the customer base out there is a customer base that many of us haven't served properly. 50% of our supplier base, in Sally's example, is probably a supplier base that we haven't leveraged properly enough. And so I think it is very clear that as we are building business cases to come out of this very fundamental crisis and build businesses that are able to survive the next decade and longer, we need to look at this customer base as one of the most fundamental drivers of economic success. I think the example of Ebony was fantastic, right? Why wouldn't you, if you are trying to make up some of the lost revenue, suddenly address a customer base that clearly has an interest, but hasn't been addressed in the same way as we've addressed I think, a more traditional way of looking at this. So for me, that is really the wake-up call. This crisis should only create, I think, the burning platform to make this a priority in a way that otherwise it would have taken much, much longer to build.
Sally.
Just to add one small thing to that, so echo everything Daniel says. I think there's also an opportunity here, because this has shown that we can all work differently as well. So actually, both as we're thinking coming out of this, or hopefully coming out of it at some point, but thinking ahead, I think we will work very differently as a company, and we'll also be able to interact differently with some of these other groups like suppliers, because some of these ideas we had of how you needed to work, where you needed to work, when you needed to work, I think have been blown out of the water. And I think for women, this could be very, liberating and a big opportunity that we can do things in a more flexible, more remote way than we thought. And I think we must make sure we don't lose that moment across the whole piece.
Ebony, did you want to contribute on that?
Not a huge amount, just more, when do we get a chance to reflect? I mean, this crisis has thrown us into a situation where we're all having to pause and reflect. And I think the big thing that comes up is our values. What is important to us? Health is important, family values. And then as businesses, you start to ask, who are your customers? And I would just say, as much as we're all struggling and battling to readjust and try and adapt to this new world, the one thing that keeps coming back to me is it's the biggest chance we've had to reflect in a long time. And with that, hopefully in the next 12 to 18 months, we can rebuild with a stronger vision and stronger values that reflect a world that we want to see.
And of the things that we've, as a community, a global community, have been reflecting on in this period, of course, we've, out of a moment of violence and crisis, we've been reflecting on Black Lives Matter and what that means for the future, and also what it means about how we see and evaluate the past, whose history has been told and whose history has not been told. The analysis that is in this report and the analysis that we're talking through as a panel, how robust do you think that is to apply to other areas of diversity than gender? So to take what people would call an intersectional approach and try and look at other areas of diversity too. Sally, in your contribution, you referred to the fact that at GSK, you clearly think a like methodology can help you address that different kind of diversity issue. Could you add to that? And then I'll call in any other panel member who'd like to make a contribution.
So I think in terms of the areas where we need to focus as a company, so clinical trials, minority suppliers, we're applying a lot of the same thinking to women, to race and ethnicity, to LGBTQ, and to disability. Those are the four areas which we work across. I'm sure, as you can imagine. I think there's specifically on the employee-based side, through as a result of the events in the US that you talk about, Julia. I think what we've seen is a real call from our employee base to do more around race and ethnicity, and a sense that we do more, particularly at GSK, a sense we do more around women and LGBTQ than we do around race and ethnicity. And as we've done a huge amount of listening with our employees, what we've really come to understand is it's harder to tackle globally than some of the other areas, because the definitions and the populations who are more or in a minority or more impacted are different in different parts of the world. So whereas we've taken a more global approach in some of the other areas, we need to take a more local, country by country approach, underpinned by some really important global fundamentals around recruitment, development, retention, and actually the culture of the organization, and what things we're inadvertently doing that may make people from minorities feel less able to thrive, contribute, etc. And what we've also seen, and it comes a bit back to value, Ebony alluded to values and purpose, etc. So we're also seeing a really strong cry from our employee base to take a stand on this publicly. So what do we stand for as a company? And for us, that's all about being able to talk about substance of what we're doing and really focusing our effort on action and then being able to talk about it versus just joining in a general sort of, call to action. So we are very focused at the moment around listening inside and outside the organization, and have a raft of specific actions that we're taking to ensure that we to ensure that we really do more here.
Yeah, I'll just jump in as well. Just from an intersectionality perspective, I think that there's a number of things that I would say are important. Daniel mentioned data and the need for more. I think sometimes we look at something on such a mass level. So from mine and looking at national sport, if we looked at gender numbers specifically, the numbers might be growing in terms of girls. But actually, if you started to break down the Asian, the Black, different communities and where they're based and their sort of population demographics, their motivations and drivers are very different and need a different level of empathy, a different level of understanding. And until you kind of start to really unpick the data, not just sometimes from a general sweep perspective, but start to get into your communities. For example, in London, from a Black community is huge. It's 13.5%, which as a market is massive. And so that's, for me, is where it's got to be data driven, first of all, but you've got to drill into specific demographics around your projects or your locations to be able to understand the different sectional parts of society.
And Julia, I think I agree obviously with both statements. The one thing I would add is I think the gender debate is almost a bit of a hook into this, right? When you think about what we're doing now in Black Lives Matter, we're taking the steps that we have taken on gender maybe just a year or two before. Right? We are by far not where we have to be in terms of gender representation on boards and the like, but at least that topic is now something that people understand, and they understand also the economic case for it, right? We know that companies that have a higher representation of women on their boards perform better. Right? I think that is not an argument we need to have anymore. So we were able now to move it to the next level. I think we have a lot of the other discussions that we just had to even take to that first step where we hopefully are now on the gender debate. So I would almost look at this report as a little lighthouse project on one of the discussions, but that should be able to apply to the much wider scope of diversity and inclusion.
Thank you. I know Brenda's had some.
Just add. Sorry, I probably got a delay on my line.
We can hear you, Brenda. Your vision's freezing a little bit, but we can hear you. So if you want to keep going.
I'm going to go off video and see if that helps. So
yes, we can definitely hear you.
I would just say all of those points, if we come back to Ebony making that case about the data in London, I think if we continue to focus on that commercial imperative, understanding your population, understanding your customer base, and as Sally rightly says, when you get into intersectionality, it's quite regional. But really looking at role modeling as well, looking at images, thinking about, we tried to make sure that we were covering a bit of intersectionality in that. And I think, really focusing on that aspect, bringing it back to what markets are we serving and do we understand them well, really helps to focus.
I think maybe the connectivity gods are not with us, and we've lost Brenda there. I know she's back. She's back. Do you want to finish that sentence, Brenda? You're all good, all good. Brenda, we might be just stressing the system here, but if you do have any connectivity, I wanted to come back to you briefly on this getting started question. In particular, for people who want to get started, how can they get their hands on the Are You Missing Millions report?
That's a very good point, Julia. The report is on both the 30% Club website, the PwC website. I think it's on the HSBC website as well. So if you Google "Are You Missing Millions" and any of those company names, you will find it. And then I think really, you know, flipping through, looking at the examples, looking at the framework, the pieces that we mentioned in the back about the data, those areas. You know, every company is going to be different with how they approach it. Every industry will be slightly different, but I think the framework is a good place to start, and really just challenging that thinking about I&D sitting in HR. I think it is about lifting it out and making it much more strategic, and, you know, looking at, does your I&D person have a voice at the C-suite? You know, does this conversation get elevated? And so it's really trying to turn that on its head.
And on that theme, so someone who's watching today, very interested in taking the next steps, gets their hands on the report, but does need some more guidance about what to do next. I mean, normally people would turn to HR, or they might have within their business professionals who work on inclusion and work on diversity. I mean, how equipped in everybody's experience are people who work on diversity and inclusion in this agenda that we're talking about now, this bringing of a commercial lens to driving change? Because you can see whether it's in your own workforce or in your suppliers or in your customer base, underserviced areas that are missing out, that can make a real difference, properly included to the bottom line. You know, what's the skill set that people generally have available to them? Is it adequate, or are there some things missing? Daniel, did you want to make a contribution on that?
Happy to. For me, this is a bit like corporate sustainability and the sustainability of a company, right? The corporate sustainability teams are very often very well equipped to help the company, but they can't do it alone. And from a D&I, is a very similar dimension here. If you don't get sponsorship from the CEO and the board, if you don't have businesses actually willing to work with you, you can be a fantastic corporate sustainability person, or you can be a fantastic D&I person, you will fail. So I think many sustainability, many D&I teams that I have met have all the skills that we need to advise and to guide, but they will never be able to design a new financing proposition or issue a bond. But you need the D&I person to actually help structure that thinking. And so for me, it's much more important to design right how we engage with the business, with the functions in a large organization, than to question whether the D&I person actually has the right skill set. I think that would be the wrong question in most cases.
Thank you. Sally.
I agree with a lot of what Daniel says. I think what I've found as I've sort of dug into this in our company is we have strong D&I people, but their objectives currently have been targeted towards our workforce, and they sit in HR. We have expertise in our procurement organization who's thinking about this. We have expertise in our R&D organization, in our marketing organization, but nobody was pulling it together. And I think that's what we're, and actually there are learnings, as Daniel said, in the way you would approach trying to build a more diverse supplier base would have a lot of the same rootings in the way you would approach trying to build a more diverse workforce. So one of the things I'm trying to do, because I am one of those people who sort of sits in the middle of it, if you like, in the way we're organised in GSK, is how can we start to bring those experts together to learn from each other, and how can we think about this as one joined up agenda where we really think about, well, which are the areas for our company where we can make the biggest difference? And as we've said throughout this, it'll be different for each different company. and where I would love to get to, if we're making choices in where to invest, which would have the biggest impact in, you know, the success of the company, and also our impact in society. And I think we're just getting started. This does feel like a new conversation, and it's quite striking every time you talk about, you know, and we've all laughed about this quite a lot through the working group, you start to talk about missing millions and everyone's head goes straight into workforce diversity. There's a big piece to do just to get, which is why it's brilliant we're having conversations like today, just to change the way people think about this. And it's been a journey for us. And I think one of the things we're all passionate about doing is how do we get more people to be thinking more holistically like this. So this is a fantastic opportunity today. Thank you for that.
To the extent any of you have encountered resistance as you've gone about this agenda, resistance to the thinking, has it been resistance based on not now, we've got a lot else going on, or has it been resistance in the sense that people have got just trapped in that thinking about their own workforce and find it hard to apply the analysis more broadly? Or is it sharper than that? Are there people who just say, I don't accept that this is a good thing for our business. I don't accept the analysis that there are missing millions. I mean, have you had frank conversations like that? I mean, one of the things that does concern me, I guess, about our advocacy, our shared advocacy for a more equal world, a more diverse way of thinking and including people, is that we often speak into silence, and so people don't actually put what's on their mind in return, and you don't get to thrash it through the way in business, in politics, we are generally used to thrashing issues through, where people are prepared to say, you think X, I think Y, okay, let's just, you know, argue it out and see if we can find any common points and you know, at least define the differences and then start working on them. Do you think that actually in corporations there is resistance, but it's quite passive aggressive style resistance? Or do you think people are persuaded, but they just don't actually necessarily know where to get started?
I might give this one an early crack. Yeah, I'm sure we've all been part of many of those frustrating conversations, right? Banging your head on the wall, trying to convince people. I think predominantly, and this is why I keep coming back to data actually, I think predominantly most people I've worked with just don't see the value, and they see it as a tick box thing that goes, like you say, on some bottom of a list rather than something to commit to. And I've been in times where, you know, you've tried to convince as a nice to do, but until you come with the data and what that adds up to, and whether it's commercial value or audience or participation, as soon as that message starts to get across, I've always seen a shift. You know, if you're trying to just pull on heartstrings, some people with headspace who they know results and how they've come in one set channel for so long, just don't seem to have the headspace to look at a new lens. But once you present it as an opportunity, I've always been told crack on. The only thing I would then say is often it's crack on your own agenda, sort it out and bring some results back, rather than let's integrate this within. And I think the hardest bit is getting it integrated within thinking of an organization. I've worked as director of women's cricket. When I started, that role didn't exist. And I would say it took 5 years to integrate across commercial, marketing, membership, the whole organization performance. And that was a lot of conversations, and you had to keep coming back to the data. Why is this important? What's the difference it's going to make? So I'd say overall, I would say there's few dinosaurs. I don't think there's too many people we are in that camp. It's more headspace and shaping the opportunity. And always I say, go back to the data. What is the opportunity ahead?
Thank you. And what does the rest of the panel think? Are you encountering too many dinosaurs, or is it more what Ebony said, that if you can show the data, people say, I love that expression, crack on, but could you crack on by yourself and just get it done? And, you know, when you fix the whole lot, you know, come back and tell us. Is there a fair bit of that going around?
So I would agree with Ebony. The data and the commercial examples are what make the difference. And sadly, I do still encounter a number of dinosaurs. But I think that's why we approached the report the way we did. We talked about coming out with guidelines and advice and things, and then we said, you know what? I think we're just going to show people. If we can show examples, if we can talk to the data, the power of some of those numbers that we had with, this was the challenge, this is the opportunity that came out, and these were the outcomes with some of the biggest companies in the world that people respect. We thought that would make the difference. And I think when we've brought it to new CEOs who hadn't thought about it, by seeing another CEO and have them talk about what happened, what was the outcome, that's what's been most powerful. And if I think back to when John and I first talked about this, we wrote out together, and certainly it was John's name on the letter, not mine, that got the attention, but we wrote to 5 or 6 leading CEOs and said, give us someone who is very senior and has access at the C-suite, who has influence to be involved in this. And happily, we got Sally and others who were not, buried deep in the organization, but were commercially respected. And that was incredibly important. So I completely agree with Ebony, have the data, but let's continue to highlight examples. And hopefully by doing this, we'll find more good examples and let people buy into it that way.
I agree with what Brenda says. I always come back to it. It feels like we're just several years behind the same argument that was made for representation, where that started as a tick box, do the right thing. And I think now you have fewer and fewer people who don't believe that a more diverse workforce leads to stronger business outcomes. And I think we almost need to just go on through the storytelling and the examples, as Brenda said, show that where that can apply in the same way through all these other aspects that we've talked about today. But it's, again, I wholeheartedly agree, it's around data and stories and examples, and then sort of light bulb moments for people of thinking this will actually help my business in terms of top and bottom line performance, but also help my business in terms of reputation, employee engagement, and all those other things. When I talk about missing millions inside GSK, and it helps people realize, all of us have a role, whatever our job is, to bring a diversity and inclusion lens into the work that we're doing, because it can apply in so many different ways. And the more you can get the whole organization kind of thinking that way, is the real power, I think, to unlocking exciting things here.
And I guess I would add, what we're seeing in PwC as we respond to requests for proposals, we're starting to put a D&I lens over all of our responses. Even if someone hasn't asked us about, D&I, we will apply that to everything that we're doing. And actually we're finding it really applies to all aspects of business. And so, the more we get companies to start thinking that way, and I think seeing people respond quite favorably when they see us take that approach, then it starts to take off.
In the minutes that remain, I'm going to go through one last round of the panel, but for your just final observations. But if you could, as you do so, direct a little bit of advice and encouragement to one question that we've had come in. It's come in from an anonymous attendee. That anonymous gets around, but anonymous in this webinar has asked for any advice on how you go about starting if you don't even have internal data on your employees. Anonymous goes on, we recognise the commercial benefits. However, internally, we don't even advertise roles as possible part-time. So we have to just get on the ladder with making changes for our own workforce. So for someone who's coming at it really needing to make the very, very first start, any words of encouragement and advice, and any final observations? I'll do a run through the panel. Ebony, if you would like to go first.
Yeah, I would say, you know, the one thing I would always say is find advocates within your environment. You know, sometimes it might feel like you're one of the few people with that lens on, but sometimes there's a couple, there's a little kind of movement that you can create. And by you guys coming together with an agenda to focus on change, it just gives that extra bit of lift and support that you don't feel like you're banging on doors on your own. That you're actually banging with a, you know, a bunch of friends that start to care and are looking at sort of whether it's managing up, whether it's managing across, really thinking about the organization. The other thing I would say actually, which is more an independent thing, is see it as an opportunity for personal growth. So I see trying to affect these agendas as an opportunity to learn how to influence better. You know, and as we all develop on our careers and want to be successful, the better opportunity in the way we articulate, communicate, and influence, that's good for us as individuals as well. So I would see it as almost two, get some people to work with you, or one, sorry, should I say, people to work with you and try and create a movement within your organization. But secondly, see it as a chance for a bit of excitement. How can I do something different and then change that lens?
Thank you. Daniel.
Yeah, maybe I just carry on from that. I had 4 quick points. One, I think similar to what Ebony just said about personal growth. I think this often is also a topic for profile for senior people in the organization. So find sponsorship from the top by making this a topic of personal conviction and personal brand. Second, I completely agree with what my colleague said. Bring the right people together. It doesn't always have to be a formal governance forum, but there will be many people in an organization that actually have that mindset, but they don't quite know how to mobilize it. So I think there's a great opportunity to bring the right people together from functions and businesses that normally would never meet. Third point we made enough today, I think, is data, data, data. And the fourth point, which I think is actually the most important one, is just try it out somewhere. This doesn't need to be the holistic company transformation on day one. Many of us run small products in certain markets, run certain marketing campaigns, overlay this with a gender lens and see what the outcome is. And very often the way to build momentum in an organization is to have a few really powerful test cases. I think this is a very obvious one here. I hope the examples in the report give you a bit of an edge, and otherwise I'm sure many of us are happy to have a follow-up conversation.
Thank you. Sally.
Really nothing to add on that piece other than, and it's not an area of my expertise, but my sense, and Brendan mentioned Birgit at the beginning, there are very powerful networks of people, I think, outside your company who have done this and been through this. And I think just trying to, for Anonymous, to try and tap into some of that, you know, best practice and experience from others and super passionate people. I think there's a lot of help you can find outside, as well as, of course, all the things others said around the sponsorship and other pieces inside the organisation.
Thank you, Sally. And Brenda, last word to you.
But I'm delighted that everyone has made all kinds of fantastic points. There isn't a lot more for me to add, other than, you know, really agreeing with everything everyone has said about the data, about the networks. You know, the phenomenal group that we've had in this work group, working with Daniel and Sally and Birgit and others, has really opened all of our eyes, I think, to things that we hadn't seen before. So I would say go and talk to other people, you know, either in your industry or out, you know, through networks, and get some help that way. And I think a very good piece of advice that was given to me by the first CEO that we signed up to the 30% Club CEO campaign was, if you look across companies on the FTSE, a lot of them are led by alpha males, rightly or wrongly, and they all like competitive sport, typically. And so if you make this a competition, you'll get more and more involved. And actually, that's how we got many of them signed up in the first place. But if you go to your company, everybody comes to me and says, Brenda, what does best in class look like? You know, how do I benchmark myself? What are others doing in my industry? And so maybe sometimes you'll make the case, you know, within your company by saying, look what our competitors are doing. Look what others are doing out there, and use that, you know, use it as a way to get people interested. And so just sometimes thinking outside the box. But as I say, the more you can talk to other people, I've gained so much from this group, and it's been one of the most exciting things I've been involved in. So, so do go and talk to others. Thank you.
I love that, and I think there is the voice of a very wise woman who takes a tendency of alpha males and uses it for her own purposes and creates the competition that she wants to see to drive the outcomes that she believes in. Brenda, thank you for that, and thank you very much for the work of the 30% Club and for all of the effort that's gone into this report. It's been fantastic to have the opportunity to talk through it. I think it's been a very refreshing discussion in that sense, and we wouldn't be able to have it without all of that effort. So thank you to you, Brenda, and thank you to everybody who contributed to the report, and to our panellists for joining us, to Ebony, to Daniel, to Sally. Thank you for being involved this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are in the world. It's 9:30 at night in Adelaide, Australia. So for me, it feels around about the right time to sign off. Thank you to everyone for joining this seminar at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. We're delighted to have you and to have the opportunity to bring thought-provoking material of this calibre to you. So thank you, and please enjoy the rest of the day or the rest of your night. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.